Hi, I'm Sam. Today is December 1st, 2016, and I'm here with Paul Millman to talk about the culture of employee ownership, the structure, and the culture of Chroma Technology Corporation. Paul, would you like to talk about yourself a little bit and what you're doing before you helped start Chroma?
My name is Paul Millman. I am currently both president and CEO of Chroma Technology. Before Chroma Technology, I worked for a competing thin film coatings company where we learned the trade, and then he fired me. And so it was my firing that was the catalyst for us starting Chroma. We had discussed the possibility of starting another company, but had gotten nowhere and weren't going anywhere with it until he fired me, and that catalyzed us, and we started Chroma. Prior to that, I'd spent 7 years in the restaurant and bar business, doing everything from waiting tables and bussing tables to tending bar and eventually to managing a nightclub in New York, which was probably the worst job I've ever had. Prior to that, I was a teacher, a school teacher. Well, after being a school teacher and before being a bartender, again, I was in sales in the furniture and gift business. And prior to that, I was a school teacher. Prior to that, I was a graduate student at Antioch in New England, and prior to that, I was a bartender, and prior to that, I was involved in student politics in the 60s and the underground press.
Okay. So how did you come to working with Omega? What attracted you to selling filters?
Absolutely nothing other than the fact that it was a job. And I needed a job. I moved to Vermont in May of 1988, and I needed a job, and there were no jobs in the restaurant business, at least none that I could find that could support a person. And I went to the State of Vermont Employment Office in Brattleboro, and as I was walking out of the counselor's office, after he told me that there were no jobs as a bartender, he said, "I see you have sales experience." And I said, uh-huh. And he said, "Have you ever sold a product that you thought was worthwhile in terms of the human species?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Would you like to try?" And I said, I needed a job. And so that's how I got the job at Omega. I was not intending to work for an optical coatings company. I was not intending to get another sales job, but it paid the bills. And although it was a rather low-paying job, it allowed me to stay in Vermont in the summer of 1988. And then at the end of the summer, I decided to stay here and continued that job.
So if you had no experience selling optical filters, but some sale experience, how long did it take you working with Omega to be as proficient as you were with Omega?
About a year, probably.
How much did you add to their sales in the few years that you worked for them?
When I started there, they had total sales of 1.1 million, and when I left, they had total sales of 3.35 million.
How many other salespeople did you work with?
There were no other salespeople. There was customer service person who did deal with customers, and to the extent that she dealt with customers, was also in sales, because I believe that customer service is sales. That person happens to be the woman that I live with, Wendy Cross, and so they were the two of us.
Okay. So leading up to getting fired from Omega, what were the tensions? What was happening in Omega that was, growing those feelings of not wanting to be there? I know that Dick didn't want to, wasn't enjoying being there, and hence resigning after you had got fired. But for you, Why did you not want to work at Omega anymore?
I never didn't want to work at Omega. It was a job. I thought it was as jobs were in Brattleboro, Vermont in 1990. It was a pretty decent job. I'd gotten raises. My salary was not wonderful, but it was better than most people in Brattleboro at the time. It certainly allowed me to live a reasonable lifestyle. I wasn't planning on leaving the job until they fired me.
So up until then, what was your relationship with Bob Johnson?
And I had an ambiguous relation with Bob Johnson. I think most people do. I think there was some mutual respect. We periodically worked together on projects, but we were not friends. And I think he had some appreciation that my efforts led to greater sales, although I don't think he believed that salespeople were necessary to sell. I think he thought that product sold itself. So it was it was somewhat respectful, excuse me, and somewhat aloof, somewhat detached.
So when he went to fire you, how did that change your relationship? Or how did that-
He became the enemy, and a target for ridicule and disdain.
So, after you were fired and you guys, you and the other founders were starting to develop Chroma and the business plan for it, how did you and the other founders, so you got fired. So how did you and the other members detach from Omega and fully employ the six of you, I guess including Lindgren?
Right. So Jay quit. He'd already quit. He was going to travel in North Africa. Frank also had already quit. He was going back to making stained glass. Dick quit after I got fired. Wendy and Vim stayed working at Omega because we didn't have any money to pay them. And so they stayed working for a while until, I believe, July or August. And then Wendy quit. And then Vim finally quit. Rusty was an independent contractor, so he didn't have to quit. He just was doing odd jobs for Omega. I think that's all of us.
What year did you get fired?
1991.
That was the same year that you and the other founders put together Omega? Not Omega, I'm sorry, Chroma?
Yeah.
How long did it take, after completing the paperwork to incorporate Chroma, to get your first product made and sold?
Incorporation was in June, and I think we shipped the first filters in October.
What was the first couple of years of sales and production like?
In numbers? Volume?
However you'd like to describe it.
The first fiscal year, which was mostly half a year, our sales were 300 and something $1,000. It depends on who you ask. It was either 318 or $328,000. The second year was over $1.5 million. It was a very heady time. It was great. We were having a great time. We knew that we were special. The world told us that we were special. Excuse me. The scientific community welcomed us with open arms. It was a wonderful time.
When you and the other founders were planning the company, did you expect to gross over $1 million in your second fiscal year?
No, not even vaguely.
I guess in those first two fiscal years, who else did you have to hire anybody else while you were just beginning?
The first year we hired, I think 3 additional people. in the first year. Hold on.
Go for it.
Hold on. Turn on for a second. This is Paul.
All right, so where were we? I think I wanted to back up actually to, I guess, your experience with employee ownership, and then why, when forming Chroma, that you pushed for it so heavily.
So the first time I heard about employee ownership in those terms was actually at Omega. Bob Johnson presented the company with the possibility of a 30% ESOP. So that means that he was going to sell 30% of the company to an employee stock ownership plan. And I'd not heard of this before. And the idea of employee ownership immediately struck me as worthwhile. It didn't strike many of the people at Omega as worthwhile, and it never happened. And I think it largely didn't happen because there was no enthusiasm among the employees except for me. But I thought it was a good idea. Employee ownership fits in with my upbringing and my background and what I believe in. I was born into a family of communists, and I am a socialist, and employee ownership was the most rational way of bringing socialism to the world. I don't believe in state socialism. I believe in employee socialism.
So that naturally informed choosing Chroma to be employee-owned.
That made me want Chroma to be employee-owned. It was not even among this. Actually, at that time, the discussion was really among four of us. There were not all seven of us were not involved. Jay was overseas. Frank was working at home. Wendy was still working at Omega. Vim was still working at Omega, although he was part of the discussion. So four of us were discussing the how to get started, basically, and the question of ownership logically followed because there were seven of us. Who was to own, who wasn't to own, how they were to own, how to raise money, how to raise capital to start the company was a big issue. Whether capital should command ownership was a big issue. And I was at least the strongest voice for employee ownership in the discussions among the four. The four were Vim, Dick, Rusty, and me.
How did they feel about employee ownership through your argumentation and persuasion?
My memory, and others may have different memories, but my memory was that I was for it, Rusty was opposed to it, Vim was ambivalent, and Dick was ambivalent. Although I think that it appealed to Dick. I don't think he thought much about it, but I think it appealed to him. I think Vim was more ambivalent about it. Rusty, I believe, was opposed to it. Rusty believed that Rusty had access to wealthy people. I don't know whether they were his parents or people that he knew. I always assumed it was his parents. And they were willing to fund the company to, my memory is, to the tune of $1 million, but they wanted a major equity stake in order to do that, and I was really opposed to that.
So where did that disagreement continue? Did Rusty end up being part of the company?
Rusty was initially part of the company. He bought shares. Everybody had to buy shares. So shares were $1 a share, and everybody had to buy at least 1,000 shares in order to show the banks and others that we might be borrowing money from that we were serious. And Rusty, in fact, bought shares. Now, most of the people, Wendy, Frank, Rusty, and Dick, I believe, borrowed the money from me to buy the shares. Jay had his own money, I believe, and I don't remember whether Vim borrowed the money or Vim got it from his family, but we all bought 1,000 shares. When Rusty left, we bought his shares back at $1,000. Then, of course, It was my $1,000, so I got the $1,000. But no interest. No, it's Wendy Hoka.
We can pick up with when did or how long was Lindgren part of the company?
Maybe 6 months, maybe less. He did some work. He did some electrical work. He was an electrical engineer. He wasn't part of the everyday happenings at Chrome at the time. Of course, we were building. They were building the equipment. I was not building the equipment. I was painting walls because they wouldn't let me near the equipment. And so I painted walls and columns and answered the telephone all at the same time. And we started getting phone calls almost immediately after opening the doors. And Rusty wasn't, he must have been there for the entire setup period where they completed the evaporation systems, because he would have been integrally involved in making sure that those functioned.
All right. So in the first couple of years, maybe even the first decade, what kind of clients were you working with? What were they?
We started out working with scientists, mostly biologists, and then we started working with companies that distributed microscopes and other equipment to those biologists, so they would resell what we made. And then by 1994, we were working directly with the manufacturers of the microscopes. And that was a big deal because they never worked with independent filter makers. And in 1994, we started working directly with Nikon in Japan. And that was a very big deal. We already were working with other instrument manufacturers, but not the microscope companies.
Were there any people that you worked with, or any scientists that were working on special projects for which you were making lenses for?
Yeah, filters. The first major customer was a company that was a division of Amoco, the oil company. They had a division called Amoco Technology, and Amoco Technology bought licensed a technology from the University of California at Lawrence Livermore that was enabled a fluorescent compound to be tagged directly to DNA. And by doing that, they were able to develop genetic tests that were done on a microscope. And so that was our first major project. And we worked through them, we worked with a lab at UCLA, the lab of Dennis Slayman, who developed one of the very early targeted drug therapies for breast cancer, for breast cancers that contained the HER2 mutation that was the cause of the breast cancer. And we worked developing a special filter set so that he could look for the mutation. And that was very exciting, because I think we made a dozen different filter sets to see if they worked, and finally made one that did. Over the years, we worked on many projects like that.
So throughout the 90s, Chroma was based out of the cotton mill down in Brattleboro, right?
An old warehouse in Brattleboro, and we just kept taking space. We took space after space after space, and finally we were everywhere in that building. And there was disjointed space, it was disconnected space, it was not clean space, but it was a lot of space.
Why did the comments you just said, obviously you would want to move to a place that was clean, that was cohesive.
Right.
What were some of the other contributing factors to move here to Brattleboro? Or not Brattleboro, but to...
There was no place to build in Brattleboro. And Brattleboro economic development people were mostly concerned with helping out another company, and they were not particularly concerned about us until we decided to leave. then they got concerned about us. But the reason we moved up here is because Bellows Falls was very inviting to us, and they helped us obtain the space. They they helped make the space buildable when it appeared that it wasn't, because of rotting timber about 38 feet below ground. They were very helpful in getting us getting this current building built and us moving into it.
What advantages did you get, explicitly in this building that, you have until now, and you're now building an expansion, but what advantages did it have explicitly?
This building? Well, it's surely cleaner than the cotton mill was. And over the years, we've made it even more clean. We've made it into a building that has pretty decent workflows. It's a much better place to work than the cotton mill was. The air is cleaner, among other things. And it's all in one building. It's not in disjointed space. In the cotton mill, we were on 3 different floors. It was just crazy to get around.
Up until moving here to Bellows Falls, how many employees did Chroma have?
I believe when we moved to Bellows Falls, we had 56. I'm not sure of that. We can check those numbers. 2 numbers stick in my head, 56 and 38. I'm not sure which one is the right one.
Was the move up here partly because you had enough employees to need a larger space?
We had enough business to need a larger space. We needed more evaporation systems. We needed more manufacturing space. We needed more inventory space. We needed more of everything. We needed more office space. We needed, and we got, and we've been here since 2003.
So over that, first 12 years before we moved up here, an increasing employee base, how did employee ownership permeate the culture? How did you see that play out in everyday work?
Well, first we had to figure out how it worked, and we contracted with a consulting company on employee ownership, a company called what was at that time called the Industrial Cooperative Association, has since shortened its name to the ICA Group. And they provided different models. We could be a co-op, or we could be an employee stock ownership plan, or we could make up our own model. The employee stock ownership plan, among other things, was too expensive for us. It cost, I don't know, $30,000 to $50,000 to get established, and we didn't have that kind of extra money. Co-ops were too. Our major objection to co-ops was 1 person, 1 share, 1 share, 1 vote. Because we didn't think that it recognized experience and longevity and seniority. So we, on the cuff, made up our current way of doing things, which is fundamentally a stock bonus plan. In the first, I don't know, at least 3 years, we said, we will take 4,000 shares of company stock and divide it among the employees, and that's what we did the first 3 years. And then, at some point, whether it was year 4 or year 5, I don't remember, we decided to standardize the number of shares that each employee got. And we must have settled on 200 shares per employee, because that's what we do. That's what we bonus now. But someplace in the recesses of my mind, I thought it was 250 at the time.
So for that first decade before y'all moved up here, how did you see employee ownership be part of how people acted and how people worked in the company?
Oh God, we used to have town meetings to make decisions, and that was at very least frightening. We used to there was a lot more interaction on decision making. There was a lot more diffuse decision making. There was a lot more anarchy. So it was if you had a responsibility to do something and you had an idea about how to do it, you did it, and there was no vetting of ideas. At the same time, there were a lot of decisions that nobody knew about except the people who made the decisions. So there was not as complete transparency as one might think. The decisions had to get made every day. I mean, I was spending money on marketing and advertising and sales and travel. Nobody ever bothered to ask me what I was doing with it. So it was a great time of people's involvement, but it was also without controls, and that was bad. I think we actually, I don't know this for a fact, but I do believe that we got involved in some deals, particularly around insurance, that would benefit one person in the company. And he did benefit from it, and he was the person who made the deals. So I've always suspected there was less than an honorable approach to deal making.
As the company grew, how were those decision-making processes changed and shaped to be more equitable or more efficient?
We tried all sorts of things. We tried a kind of a representative body that where representatives of each of the work groups would get together, and they would plan scheduling, and they would plan projects. I wasn't on that group, so I don't know what exactly they did. I do know that it became chaotic. It wasn't always the same representative, and I think that they had questions about what their authority was, mostly they were involved in production. When we in 1999, well, no, I think maybe it was 2000. The first person left. So the question was how to buy back her shares, at what value. And that precipitated a major argument, largely between the person who was the company's controller at the time and me. And it was carried out mostly in emails. And the argument was about how to value the shares. And I thought we needed some form of valuation that had some relationship to market value. And he argued that shares should be valued at book value, which is how co-ops are valued. And when we finally got around to valuing the shares for the first person that left, we did value them at book. And we thought we would continue the discussion and to see if there were other forms of valuation that we wanted to entertain, but we never did. The irony, of course, is when the person with whom I was having the argument left the company, he sued to have the valuation be more than book value. He was not an honorable person. So when it was not in his interest, when it was in his interest for shares to be valued at book, he argued for that. When it was in his interest for shares to be valued at market, he argued for that. I think in the world that exists in my mind, employee ownership only works if there is consistency. I'm not sure I care what you're consistent about, as long as you're consistent and as long as what you do is in the interests of the greater number of people. Employee ownership doesn't work. I think most things don't work, but I especially think that employee ownership doesn't work when people only see their interests. It is in our individual interest, those of us who founded this company, to sell the company. The company is worth more in a sale to a venture capitalist than it will ever be in the methodology that we use to buy back shares. Whether it's book value or ESOP value, the value in the marketplace is probably 4 times what even an ESOP value is, and that makes it probably 8 times what our book value is. So it is in our interest, those of us who founded the company and those people who have been here the longest, to sell the company to somebody who wants to pay us all that money. It is not right. It is not in the interest of people who want to retain quality jobs that afford them quality lifestyles. So therefore, whenever the issue comes to the surface, I, although tempted, argue against selling to an outside interest. There are many reasons why one doesn't want to sell to outside interests, largely because they end up screwing up the company terribly. Very few acquisitions that I know of by venture capital companies or private equity companies actually succeed. We've had brother and sister companies in our industry, not the filter industry, but the biotech industry, that have been gobbled up by big companies, and most of them are gone at this time.
So in the way that you were describing the difference between self-interest and collective interest with the founders, how have you seen that collective interest grow within the employee owner base as the company has grown?
I don't know if it has. And I don't know what it's going to be like when I'm not here. I once said to a colleague here, younger colleague, that she had to believe that she wouldn't want to sell the company. And she said, I cannot tell you what I will feel when I have as many shares as you have. And my response is, I already have that many shares. And I believe that we shouldn't sell the company. So it's hard to know what people really believe when they're torn between self-interest and collective interest. And maybe we didn't do a good enough job explaining to people about that. Maybe I didn't do a good enough job transmitting that kind of thinking to people. I'm sure that there are many, 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 many people at Chroma who feel this the way I do. But I'm not sure how much it philosophically goes beyond Chroma. So once I said to a group of employees in a work group, what if somebody offered us $1 million? $100 million, I'm sorry. And one of them says, we should sell. This is somebody who'd been here for, 10 years at the time. So $100 million was probably worth $2 million to him, $3 million maybe. And I said, pointing to one of his co-workers in his work group, but she hasn't been here for as long as you've been here, so it's not worth to her what it's worth to you. And he said, well, we should do something to make it worth more for her, and then sell the company. So there was not the philosophic underpinnings to his thinking. I don't really know how widespread it is. I like to think it's fairly widespread. I do know among people that I speak with, it seems to be cherished, but I think that I speak with a relatively small number of people, and I don't know what the others think. I'd like to think that we've created something that is a model for how things ought to be. But it's only a model about how things ought to be if the people who would live in this model would do the same thing if they had the opportunity to start their own company. So I don't know.
No, I think that's a good answer. I think that covers a lot of the bases. So I kind of want, transitioning from employee ownership culture, I want to talk about how the company's structure developed from when it was just the original 6 founders, excluding Lindgren, and how it developed over the years.
Well, as you can imagine, when there were 6 of us, we all had very specialized areas of responsibility. Wendy was customer service, I was sales, Vim was developing the software that ran the manufacturing systems. Jay was a specialist in design of coatings. Frank was the guy you went to if you needed something done fast. And Dick had managerial experience at Omega, so we had a group of specialists, and so everybody respected everybody else's domain and expertise. And then, as I alluded to earlier, as we started growing, we started having meetings at which things were discussed and ostensibly decisions were made, but we also made decisions without meetings, and individuals made decisions. Right after the attempt, there was, so what I didn't get to in the discussion of the disagreement between me and the controller was that he actively tried to create a palace coup and to rid the company of me. And he did this in very underhanded and very secretive ways. He would slither around like a snake and try to gain allies in this effort. What he underestimated was the bond between the 6 founders. We were not the same people. We lived very different lives. But there was a bond among us that was impenetrable and continues to be. And so when challenged, the founders stuck together, and there was no way that he could win that vote. So what we did was we said, and we we had a board of directors that did not function. I should note that at the first board of directors meeting, shortly after we founded the company, we had to elect officers. And I was not elected president. And even Wendy voted against me. Dick was elected president. I became president in the after the millennium. And we were very, very consciously concerned about authority. We were very unconsciously concerned about authority also. And we did not like people who had too much authority. We did not like people with power. We were, after all, children of the 60s, all of us, in some way or another, the early part of the 60s or the late part of the 60s. And not trusting people over 30 and letting the people decide, and one man, one vote, and blah, 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 all were us. And so, although we had a board of directors that didn't function, but after the attempted coup, we decided the board of directors would function and would be the leadership of the company. And the 6 founders were made permanent members of the boards of directors, as long as they were as long as they continued to be full-time employees, and that there would be 3 other members of the board of directors voted on by the employee owners. So the founders retained the majority status on the board. That precipitated a period where the board was also managing the company, and that was craziness. And as was our history, we got another controller. Why is it always controllers? Who decided to mount a coup in the company.
A second coup?
A second coup. This time, he tried to enlist my support in the coup. And he was going to overthrow Dick as president and institute another founder as president. Subjectively, I believe his intent was to make that other person president because he felt that he could control that other person. And then at the meeting where this was all to happen, I didn't vote for it. And that caused him great consternation. He left under a cloud later on. But the board was not the place to manage the company. It never has been. And so, in order to create some kind of management that did not include Jay or me, because Jay and I were the adversaries in some fashion about how the company was to be led. So we had to have an organ that didn't include Jay and Paul, and we created a steering committee that had, I believe, 7 members, only 2 of which were full-time jobs. All the others had day jobs and worked on the steering committee in their non-day job hours. And that was crazy. It had the effect of beginning to show us that management had a place at Chroma, but it wasn't fully fledged management.
When was that committee founded, or when was it, actually making changes in the company?
I think it was around 2005 or 2006. It may have been 2006. I think, I want to say Dick retired in 2007, and he was a member of the original steering committee. And then when it became apparent that you couldn't have a day job and also do this work, and that we actually needed full-time people to do management work, we created the second generation of the steering committee, and it contained 4 people: a sales manager, an operations manager, and 2 production managers. And it moved us forward. It began to show how thought out decision-making in production would work. Of course, sales was not included in there. Was the sales included? Okay, operations manager. No, we did have a sales manager, but the culture was that I did sales. And so I think there was now the sequence is the original group did not have a sales manager. They wanted a sales manager. The person that we approached to be sales manager didn't want to be sales manager, so the operations manager became the sales manager, and the sales manager, the one we wanted for sales, became the operations manager. And that sales manager and I got along well. I liked him. I thought he was immensely talented, and I thought that he was had a future at Chroma. He had a hard time concluding decisions and carrying through on them, and eventually he left. My understanding of why he left was that he and his then wife wanted to live out west, and they moved to Colorado or something like that. I know he's still around the industry somewhere. I have not seen him. He was a smart, very, very smart guy. And I think that had he stayed, he'd have been an important person in leadership of the company.
So in directing the role, I guess, of what the coordinating committee has done in the past, what is that structure looking like now? How is the management structure developing?
Management structure evolved this year, where we have now 5 chiefs, as it were, although we're looking for another term. We have a chief executive officer, a chief financial officer, a chief technical officer. These are all positions, not people, mind you. A chief customer officer and the chief operations officer. We have 3 people fulfilling those 5 roles. The chief financial officer and the chief operations officer are filled by one person. The CEO and the chief customer officer are both me, and the chief technical officer is another person. We're looking in the not too distant future to add to the number of people we have in those roles, so that eventually we actually have 5 doing 5 jobs. And I will retire next year, 2017, or the year after that, 2018, and somebody else is going to become CEO, and I suspect it'll be somebody from that group. And so we'll have to fill in other places.
So between the chief positions and the work groups themselves, what is the structure between those two?
There are, at this point, 2 production managers. We will hire a third. There's an engineering manager. There's an IT manager, but that's basically managing one work group. There will be a quality manager as opposed to a quality systems director. Quality manager is an activist position. It's somebody who makes sure we do things right instead of just tells us the right way to do things. I didn't understand this for a very long time, but director of quality systems develops the quality system doesn't mean that that person actually makes it happen.
So are both of those positions going to be there, or are they going to have one?
Both of those positions will be there, but one will be a superior position. The manager will be the superior position. And I think, now, we also have a subsidiary, and they have an operations manager up there. We also have overseas sales offices, and they have general managers there. I suspect we'll continue to develop some additional layers of management, but not too many, because for the most part, what we really like about Chroma is that the work groups manage themselves, and we think that's real healthy. I think it's healthy both for people's sense of self. It's healthy because people who do the work tend to make the innovations that make the work easier and better. I don't ever think we'll have a structure where every department has a foreman or a supervisor or something like that. It just feels uncomfortable.
How does it tie into the culture and the experience of being an employee owner of this company? Or how do you think it ties into the experience of those work groups?
So many years ago, when I was vice president and was in charge of sales, and and that was undisputed, I was working late. We were still in Brattleboro at the cotton mill, and there was a thin films technician who was had orders for two different mirrors, and he didn't know which one to make first. So I said, well, I know the customers. You make that one first because that customer is more important. He said, you can't tell me what to do. I'm an owner here too. So structure affects ownership. We recently had somebody say, when we introduced the C-suite and the structure to date, somebody said, does that mean I have a boss now? Well, they always did. Just didn't know it. We didn't think it. It changes the way people think. It changes the way they operate. One hopes that it changes them in a liberating way so that things that they shouldn't have to deal with, they don't have to deal with, and things that they should have to deal with, they do have to deal with. But there's no guarantee that that's how people think.
I mean, so we're actually at 51 minutes. So, at 51 minutes, are there any final remarks, comments about the topics we've talked about that you want to cover before we finish?
I have a friend who is the CEO of a trust company, a local trust company in Vermont, and that trust company is employee-owned. Somebody once said to him, and before that, he and his entire team had worked as the trust department of a bank. They all got fired, set up their own company. Sounds familiar. And they're incredibly successful. But somebody once said to him, what's the difference between leading the trust department of a bank and being CEO of an employee-owned trust company? And he said, I have to explain myself more. Employee ownership is more difficult. It's more difficult for a number of different kinds of people. It's more difficult for people like me who think they know the answers. It's more difficult for people who think that they have technological sophistication that others don't have. These things are true. It is a more difficult way to do things. It's the right way to do things. He's since died. There is a very, 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 very large, formerly employee-owned defense contractor in San Diego. The company is called SAIC. And the man who started the company, Dr. John Beister, got it into his head that it ought to be an employee-owned company. So he set up one of the most magnificent, one of the most complex employee-owned companies in the world. 10,000 employees, this is not 130. They had an internal stock market where employees could buy and sell shares. And it made his ownership less valuable. So somebody who I think was probably questioning his sanity, as people have questioned mine, said to him one day, why did you make this company employee-owned? And he said, because it's fair. And that says everything. John Beister says it better than I could with fewer words than I would. It's right because it's fair. It's more difficult. It's more complex. It is sometimes more emotionally draining. But it's always fair.
Thank you very much, Paul Millman.
You're welcome.